Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church Sunday School Lesson number 8, Sunday, October 21st, 2018. The lesson is entitled The First Murder. The lesson text comes from Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 16. Related scriptures come from Matthew chapter 23, verses 29 through 36. John chapter 15, verses 19 through 25. 1 John chapter 3, verses 10 through 15. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22 through 24. The place is unknown and the time is unknown. Little by little, the wonderful world that God had created was getting tarnished by sin. This week we learn of the first murder. Today's aim, facts. To learn the facts about the first murder that was committed in history. Principle, to see that because sin lies in wait to trip us up, we must always be ready for it. Application, to acknowledge that God offers us his mercy in the midst of our sin and calls us to recognize it. Illustrating the lesson, sin destroys all that it comes in contact with, but God's mercy will preserve those who are faithful to him. Practical points. 1. All life is precious, for God is the source of all life. Genesis 4, 1 through 2. 2. God honors our faith in him as we give him the best that we have to offer. Verses 3 through 5. 3. We must be on guard at all times not to allow our emotions to leave us vulnerable to sin's control. Verses 6 through 7. 4. Nothing in our lives can be hidden from God. Verses 8 through 10. 5. Our life's work becomes fruitless and difficult as sin separates us from God. Verses 11 through 12. 6. God is merciful to protect us from the full weight of our sin. Verses 13 through 16. Golden text. And God said, "What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground." Genesis 4:10. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is a developing problem. Genesis 4, 1 through 5. The second is a fateful reckoning, Genesis 4, 6 through 12. And the third is a pressing concern, Genesis 4, 13 through 16. Introduction. A fun thing to do on the bank of a river is skipping rocks. When a small flat rock is thrown at a shallow angle, it will skip several times across the surface of the water. Ripples roll across the surface of the water, gradually growing larger in size. In last week's lesson, we saw some of the results of Adam and Eve's sin, practically the judgments God pronounced against them. This week, we will see that, like the ripples rolling across the surface of water, there were more and expanding results. We tend to think that our actions are confined to our own lives, but the reality is that what we do affects others. The perfect world of Adam and Eve was marred when they disobeyed God by eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. A developing problem. Genesis 4, 1. And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Verse 2. And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Verse 3. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. Verse 4. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. Verse 5. But unto Cain and to his offering he had no respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. 2 sons, Genesis 4, 1 through 2. In this context, the word knew it as a euphemism for sexual intercourse, after which Eve conceived and gave birth to Cain. The name Cain in Hebrew sounds much like the Hebrew verb that means to acquire or to get, though it was usually the father in Scripture who named the children. In this case, Eve did so. She explained that she had received a man from the Lord, so perhaps she thought this might be the seed that God had promised her. 3:15. It is commendable that she recognized her son was from God. The name Abel is from a word that means empty or vanity, referring to something transitory like a vapor or breath. In naming Cain, Eve recognized that new life comes from God. In naming Abel, she recognized that human life on earth is relatively brief compared to the existence of God and that which is eternal. Both facts are true, of course, and remind us that God is the giver of this brief life and should be the only one to take life. Of course, he can direct authorities to do so in fulfilling the demands of justice. The two boys grew and chose two different occupations, apparently based on their different interests. Abel became a shepherd, probably caring for both sheep and goats, and Cain became a farmer, working with the soil. Both of these were commendable occupations needed for the survival of the people. Abel is mentioned first in verse 2 without explanation, even though he was the second son born. Perhaps this points to his affirmity towards religious dedication as revealed in the upcoming offerings. Two offerings, Genesis 4:3-4a. We cannot know how much time elapsed between verses 2 and 3. But verse 3 begins by observing that some amount of time had passed before what is described next. Both men seem to have been thoroughly settled in their life's work and came to a point in time when they wanted to show gratitude to God. They chose their offerings from their lines of work. So Cain's offering was from what he had produced by his working of the soil, and Abel's offering was from his flock. Abel is specifically said to have brought from the firstborn of his flocks, with special attention called to his use of their fat. This naturally leads us to wonder, had God previously given some instructions? When offerings are later described in the book of Leviticus, these two things are mentioned as important. It was specific for many of the animals' sacrifices that the firstborn be offered. In each of the sacrifices, there were special instructions regarding the burning of the fat. It is also possible that the details about Abel's offering merely indicate he was bringing the best that he had. There are no such corresponding words describing Cain's offering. If that is the intended contrast, we get a clear indication that Abel was more spiritually minded than Cain and understood that God deserved nothing but the best. Such a mindset is a good reminder for us. God always deserves our best, not our leftovers. Two responses. Genesis 4:4b-5. The next statement, and the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect, has long been the subject of discussion and debate. In Leviticus, both grain and animal offerings are described as being acceptable to God. The question remains, therefore, as to why God accepted Abel's offering but not Cain's. The simplest explanation of God's acceptance of Abel's offering is found in Hebrews 11:4, where we read that by faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts. But what did Abel have that Cain did not? Some believe the difference was in their attitudes rather than in the specific offerings. In Genesis 4 through 5, the name of the person is mentioned prior to the offering in each case, indicating that it was the person God responded to. Others believe that God must have given instruction about the necessity of shedding blood for the offerings, although we have no record of it. John MacArthur wrote, Abel's offering was acceptable, not just because it was an animal, nor just because it was the very best of what he had, nor even that it was the culmination of a zealous heart for God, but because it was in every way obedient, given according to what God must have revealed. Cain's attitude was clearly a problem, whether it was a lack of faith in not bringing the first fruits and his best, or a case of direct disobedience. We do know that God cares about both the intentions of our hearts and the quality of what we give. In some way, Cain displeased God in his offering. A fateful reckoning. Verse 6. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth? And why is that thy countenance fallen? Verse 7. If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Verse 8. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. Verse 9. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? Verse 10. And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Verse 11. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which have opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. Verse 12. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. God's challenge to Cain. Genesis 4:6 through 7. The rejection of his offering made Cain very angry, causing him to go into a deep sulk that showed in his countenance. When God saw this, he asked Cain 2 questions. Why art thou wroth? And why is thy countenance fallen? The Hebrew word translated wroth is hara and means to glow or grow warm, which figuratively refers to blazing up. Cain had a temper tantrum, and he could not hide it. Such extreme emotions on our part cannot be hidden from those around us. We do not know definitively why God rejected Cain and his sacrifice, nor do we know how God indicated this. But he obviously had done so clearly enough, and Cain reacted with anger and resentment. Moreover, his attitude did not improve after he was addressed by God, but only intensified, for the attack on Abel came after God had made it clear to Cain that he could still find acceptance if he did well. On the other hand, sin was at his door, and he would fail if he did not conquer it. The word behind lieth in Genesis 4:7 carries the picture of crouching like an animal ready for a sneak attack. Cain's anger blocked him from choosing the right response. He needed to master his anger and desire for revenge, but his anger, coupled with envy toward his brother, proved to be strong, and he was not able or willing to change. What a strong warning to us about the danger of allowing sinful attitudes to control our thinking. Sinful actions follow, and we find ourselves in deep rebellion against God. Cain's angry reaction, Genesis 4:8. Cain allowed his anger and resentment to build, leading to an extreme and unprecedented act, the murder of his brother. Since he had dismissed God's gracious correction, Cain's relationship with him deteriorated to the extent that it destroyed his relationship with his brother. This pattern, established so early in mankind's existence, recurs repeatedly today. When we are not in right relationship with God, we cannot be in right relationship with one another. Anger, envy, selfishness, strife, and bitterness will damage all human relationships. Anger is an especially powerful emotion that is warned about in many texts of Scripture. It becomes the means leading to violence and the potential of committing many sins against people and God. It is imperative that we allow the Spirit of God to give us victory over the destructive emotion. God's question to Cain, Genesis 4:9. Cain's question was quickly met by a direct question from God. Where is Abel thy brother? God already knew, of course, but he wanted to give Cain an opportunity to confess. Instead, Cain, like his parents, tried to hide from the truth by claiming ignorance and lack of responsibility for his brother's well-being. Again, we see a callous indifference toward both God and his brother. What a revelation of human irresponsibility it is to see Cain so angry with God that his only means of getting back at him was to kill his brother. God's judgment on Cain, Genesis 4:10 through 12. There's a definitive parallel between God's dealings with Cain in Genesis 4 and his dealings with Adam and Eve in chapter 3. In both instances, the Lord asked questions, not to get information, for he knows everything, but to give the culprits opportunity to tell the truth and confess their sins. In both instances, the sinners were evasive and tried to cover up what they had done. Just as Adam and Eve had faced judgment from God, so now did Cain. God immediately let Cain know that he was aware of what had occurred and then proceeded to tell him what the consequences would be. This is the third curse recorded in Genesis. The first in 3:14 was on the serpent, the second in verse 17, the ground, and the first to fall directly on a human. It fell on Cain because of his brother's shed blood, which God said was received by the earth. Cain's curse, therefore, was that the ground would resist his attempts to cultivate it and receive its produce. The twofold curse expanded beyond the resistance of the ground to yield crops. Cain would now become a vagabond, wandering over that ground. He would no longer be able to enjoy the settledness of farming. God himself had become resistant to him, which caused him to lose previous blessings of family closeness and productive work. Even so, God was gracious in that he did not take Cain's life. A pressing concern. Verse 13. And Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Verse 14. And behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. Verse 15. And the Lord said unto him, therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Verse 16. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. Cain's fear. Genesis 4:13 to 14. Cain's response was one of self-pity rather than remorse over what he had done. He was distressed by his punishment, but he did not repent of his actions. His fear was expressed in his complaint that the punishment was more than he could bear, and that he would now be a loner and hunted by others. Instead of expressing a submissive attitude, his statement appears to blame God. Thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. Cain feared that in being driven away from everybody, he would be hidden from God himself. Accordingly, being a fugitive and a vagabond would result in constant wandering with no means of protection available to him. His greatest fear was that anyone finding him would kill him. He viewed all relationships as broken, from his relationship with God to his relationships with all other human beings. Such alienation led to great fear in his heart. There is a severe warning in this passage about the cost of sin. The first result of sin is separation from God. Unbelievers are separated because they have no relationship with God to begin with. Believers can lose the closeness of fellowship with Him when they allow sin to come between them and God. Alienation from God is just the beginning of the potential for alienation and fear between us and other people in our lives. Our individual concern needs to be primarily on our relationship with God. God's protection, Genesis 4:15 through 16. Once again, God was gracious and merciful. He responded to Cain's outburst of accusation and fear by promising a measure of protection, even though what he feared would have been entirely deserved. What God would do to anyone who harmed Cain would be far worse than what that person would have done. Here we see the first indication of God's latter statement. To me belongeth vengeance and recompense. Their foot shall slide in due time. Deuteronomy 32:35. In order to visibly portray his promise to protect Cain and as a warning, God put a mark on him. Many ideas have been presented as to what this mark was, but since it is not explained in the text, we do best to just accept that it was some sort of visible sign. MacArthur noted that it involved some sort of identifiable sign that if he was under divine protection, which was mercifully given, this should cause us to thank God for his mercy. Questions. 1. What do Eve's names for her sons indicate about her understanding of God? 2. What were the brothers' vocations and how did these bear on what they brought to God as an offering? 3. What are some explanations for why God rejected Cain and his offering? 4. How did Cain react and what did God ask him about that? 5. Despite his rejection of the sacrifice, what did God graciously make clear to Cain? 6. What warning did God give Cain about sin that we also need to hear? 7. Why did God ask Cain about his brother? How did he respond? 8. What was God's twofold curse pronounced upon Cain? 9. What was Cain's greatest fear regarding his punishment? 10. How did God promise to protect Cain as he wandered? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, October 21st, 2018. Thank you for listening. God bless.